i relatori che sono già presenti, in particolare quelli che vengono da più lontano. Abbiamo una provenienza nordica, come dire, consistente, significativa, quindi grazie per la vostra presenza in particolare. Questo è il primo convegno di una serie, di un progetto più ampio, a cui il Centro Studi e Ricerche dà molta importanza. È una pista relativamente nuova che stiamo aprendo, ma su questi argomenti credo che gli organizzatori e i responsabili scientifici del progetto siano ancora più competenti di me, per cui volentieri io lascio la parola a Gianpietro Sogliani, e ringraziando lui e poi Paolo Bonafede, che sono stati insieme al collega Nicoletti che mi ha preceduto nella direzione del centro, gli artefici principali di questo progetto. Grazie e buon lavoro.
Paolo. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone participating in presence and online to this conference dedicated to politics and law, themes and influences of the second scholasticism on Rosminian thought. I would like to thank Professor Paolo Marangon, who is the new director of the Antonio Rosmini Study and Research Center, based in the University of Trento. Thanks also to Professors Michele Nicoletti and Paolo Bonafede for organizing this conference and giving their fundamental scientific support. Thanks to the invited speakers and discussants for accepting to be here in Trento and Rovereto and giving their scientific contribution. Antonio Rosmini was a priest, a theologian, a philosopher, and the founder of the Institute of Charity. He took part in the political and ecclesiastical events of the first half of the 19th century. Rosmini's influence on many Italian and non-Italian thinkers is nowadays undisputably and largely recognized. He left a huge corpus of writings, 62 volumes in the critical edition, and letters. The aim of Rosmini was to build an encyclopedia of human thought called Sistema della Verità, connected in an organic way each field of knowledge. For many decades, Rosmini writings were mainly studied to defend them against accusations coming from some Jesuit, Dominican, and neo-scholastic thinkers. On the other hand, Italian neo-idealism created the historiographical myth of Rosmini as the Italian Kant. For these reasons, Rosmini's doctrines were analyzed time by time to relate them with those of Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, and German classical philosophers. However, in 2007, Rosmini's beatification gave a new impulse to those lines of research often disregarded or undervalued. Many scholars began to study Rosmini in more detail by also considering many neglected aspects, themes, sources, and unconsidered influences of his system of truth. The three-year project on Rosmini and second scholasticism must be placed inside this recent wave of research. As scientific organizer of this project, Professor Michele Nicoletti, Paolo Bonafede, and I have chosen the expression second scholasticism, coined by Carlo Giacon in the 20th century, to deal with the early modern scholastic wave of thought from the last decades of the 13th century to the second half of the 19th century. Carlo Giacon was an important scholar engaged in a rediscovery of the early modern scholasticism, but he also wrote and edited some books connected with Rosmini. For example, he wrote L'oggettività in Rosmini and published an important edition of Rosmini's I principi della scienza morale. However, we are conscious of the ongoing historiographical debates about the term scholasticism in general and early modern scholasticism in particular. In this regard, I wish to notice only two aspects. First, we have chosen the expression second scholasticism without any ideological intention. And second, this two-day conference was preceded by an introductory seminar held on December 1st, 2023, in which Professor Igor Agostini and I have provided a preliminary account of early modern scholasticism and Rosmini's perspective on the history of scholasticism from the medieval period up to the syncretistic scholasticism of the 19th century. This 3-year project on Rosmini and second scholasticism is moved by the ambition of exploring an often undervalued field of research, bringing together distinguished scholars from two apparently different worlds, namely early modern scholasticism and Rosminian studies. Therefore, our wish for this first annual conference is the same wish that Rosmini imagined for the civil society, a long public and free debate. Thank you once again to everyone for being here. I leave the floor to Paolo Bonafede for a brief presentation of the project on Rosmini and second scholasticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Oh, the sound is good. Wonderful. So, good afternoon to all participants, even the online participants. Thank you for being here. And today marks the commencement of a research journey delving into the relationship between Rosmini and scholastic authors of the early modern age. As Gianpietro noted, this journey already had a significant initial moment last December, with a first and general exploration of this thematic framework. So, a brief summary. For a considerable duration, scholarly attention concerning the relationship between Rosmini and the scholastic tradition has focused on medieval sources, Thomas Aquinas, and to a lesser extent, Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, John Duns Scotus, and at most, in modern age, Francisco Suarez. Our aim, our objective, starting from the conference of these days, is to examine the probable influence that the modern scholastic tradition exerted on what Rosmini termed Sistema della Verità, system of truth, an epistemic organism not static, but continually integrable and perfectible. The Rosminian system was made through the contribution of those who delved into philosophical and theological issues before him. And in this sense, we hypothesize that even modern scholastic tradition is part of the complex and integrated mosaic of Rosminian sources. This research project starts with the examination of legal political issues, central to both Rosmini and authors of the second scholasticism. We will continue next year, in 2025, with research focused, on the ethical sphere, and then in 2026 we conclude with reflection on metaphysics. The aim is to provide a comprehensive, diverse, and intricate overview of the relationship between Rosmini and modern scholastic authors. This is part of a project of the Antonio Rosmini Study and Research Center that believe that this objective enable rigorous exploration of the history of thought and, if necessary, validates the European dimension of Antonio Rosmini's thought. In fact, Rosmini remains a relatively unknown figure, especially beyond Italian borders. Yet he engaged in dialogue with a broad spectrum of Western philosophers, from Plato to Kant, Hegel, and even Marx. Starting from this dialogical and historical confrontation, we intend to enlarge Rosminian studies beyond Italy. We start with this conference, but we intend to extend our results through national and international publications. This enlargement of Rosminian studies is also the core of our national project, coordinated by Gianpietro and me, who will realize a digital platform for scholars and people who want to approach Rosmini's thought with his main works. Therefore, I thank all the scholars that joined us in this scientific research, and I wish you all fruitful days in this scholarly project. Thank you, and we can start with our session. I leave the floor.
Siamo già in ritardo, quindi io lascio la parola subito al professor Wim de Kock, che ci onora della sua presenza e insegna all'Università di Louvain-la-Neuve, storia del diritto, più altre discipline. Appunto, scusate, ci parlerà di private law and contract law in the second scholasticism. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, of course, first of all, I would really like to thank the director of the Center, Rosmini, Professor Marangon, for organizing, for hosting this event. And of course, to Professor Michele Nicoletti and Gianpietro Soliani and Paolo Bonafede for having invited me to participate in this particular session of your research project. I'm also very grateful to Dr. Simoncelli for the fact that he has taken the time to read this night, I suppose, my conference paper in order to be able to comment upon it. So, so apparently I have half an hour, so 30 minutes to talk to you about the legal and political thought of the early modern scholastics. Of course, as you know, a lot can be said about this, so I will not be able to do justice to the whole wealth of the early modern scholastic thinking about legal and political philosophy. So I apologize for that in advance. What I would like to do with you is do three things, essentially. First of all, perhaps spend a couple of words very briefly on, I think, the interest, the utility of studying both 19th century Catholic intellectuals such as Rosmini and the early modern scholastics. Just a couple of words about that. Then secondly, I will go to the core of my paper, which is a very synthetic overview of some of what I think are the main points in early modern scholastic political philosophy. I will talk to you very briefly about their constitutionalist view of power. I will very briefly talk to you about their doctrine of the indirect power of the church in temporal affairs, and also about the fact that they stress the need for governments to respect natural rights of the citizens. So that's going to be the core of my talk. And then I will conclude by a couple of remarks that brings me back again to the 19th century, to Rosmini, and reflect upon what these early modern scholastics and Rosmini might have had in common. So that's a lot of work. So let's immediately go to the heart of the matter. What struck me in the paper by Dr. Soliani was the fact that at some point he mentioned that in a letter, if I remember well, from January 1836 to a bishop or to a reverend priest that was a friend of Rosmini, he recommended this friend of him to read a work by Leonardus Lessius. Leonardus Lessius, who is an early modern scholastic from the Low Countries, that is one of our national heroes, so to speak. And he recommended him to read his work on the choice of life, on the choice of life, basically. I was fascinated by this reference because it clearly is an example of the fact that Rosmini was aware of the existence of early modern scholastics and that he knew really some of their most important works in spirituality, but also in law and politics. Dr. Soliani has really clearly shown that Rosmini cites, for example, Thomas Cajetan, that he cites Francisco Suarez, that he cites Leonardus Lessius, that he cites Juan de Lugo, and all these treatises on justice and right, often perhaps indirectly through 18th century moral theologians such as Liguori. But at least I think, your project, is useful, is really very meritorious, if I may say, because it tries to draw attention to these links. At the moment when Liguori was recommending reading Lessius to his priest friend in the 1830s, we actually witnessed in Belgium a moment that is also very important when it comes to studying the relationship between 19th century and early modern scholasticism. Because right in these 1830s, we have the refoundation of the Catholic University of Louvain, and the first rector of this university, Monseigneur de Ram, he was a great fan of the early modern scholastics, and especially of Lessius. Like, he would go to many libraries to collect the lecture notes that had been taken during the courses of Lessius. So we can see that there is really this link between the 19th century and the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's strange, we can debate about that later, to see that for a long time, in the secondary literature at least, this link has been neglected. So I think that could be a point of discussion later. Here, just in that first very little part of my talk, I just want to say that I'm really grateful to you for having put this again on the agenda, because it's clear that a lot of interesting new research can be done in this field. Okay. But let me go to the political thought of the early modern scholastics. So you have noticed already that I prefer to use the term early modern scholasticism because I'm very much influenced by people like Jacob Schmutz or Leinze, who try to say that, look, the scholastic tradition is a tradition that goes from around 1100 until basically the end of the 20th century. So in order to avoid any kind of hierarchical thinking, let's just use the time period to make more precise which scholastic that we're talking about. So that's why I'm using early modern scholasticism rather than Seconda Scholastica, even though I'm actually agreeing with Carlo Giacon that we should pay attention to the Italian roots of the revival movement of Thomism when we look at early modern scholasticism, something that is a bit neglected now when people only focus on the school of Salamanca and the Spanish side of the story. So I think it's really useful to stress that there is this Italian moment in Pavia in already the end of the 15th century when Cajetan decides to use the Summa Theologica as the basis of his teachings and no longer Peter Lombard's sentences. So there is this Italian moment, which I think is very important. And because Cajetan is very important, I would like to start with him to illustrate what I think is one of the main points of early modern scholastic political doctrine, and it is this constitutionalist view of the origins of civil power. And in the work of Cajetan, this is stressed directly, but also indirectly, to the extent that Cajetan, of course, his main concern is an internal ecclesiastical affair. He wants to, of course, emphasize the power of the Pope in comparison to the power of the council, because he has to deal with the conciliarists. He also has to deal, very literally, he will have to deal with Martin Luther, who will negotiate with Luther. So he has to deal with all these attacks towards papal power. And then within this context, he will stress the fact that, well, the only person in power to have received his power directly without mediation from God is the Pope. And so, of course, in this context, he also develops the idea that all kinds of civil power are always like mediated forms of divine power, because he, of course, knows the conciliarists, and he takes from the French conciliarists, notably from Jacques Almain, this idea that power rests originally with the community. And of course, the conciliarists said that then the community gives also within the church the power to their representatives, to the bishops, so to the council, not to the Pope. But this is something Cajetan doesn't accept. But he knows these whole theories of the conciliarists, and he accepts it when it comes to the analysis of the origins of civil power. He says, look, power is something divine, that's true, but God gave it first to the whole community of the citizens, and then in a second moment, the community of the citizens could decide to give it by a kind of a compound, by a kind of a contract, a pactum, is a term they use in Latin. They could give it to their king. Okay, so that's, I think, one of the main points through early modern scholastic political doctrine, and we already find it true in the context of discussions about conciliarism and the power of the Pope, but we find it really in Cajetan. Of course, it's become, the expression of this idea has become much more associated with big names, like, for example, Francisco Suarez, who will also be at the center of Luisa Brunori's talk. But in matters of, let's say, political thought, Suarez, was, of course, very much involved in this very practical affair of the English King James I, who tried to assert like his divine origins, the theory of the divine rights of kings. And Suarez didn't agree with that. And in his Defensio Fidei Catholicae of 1613, in his defense of the Catholic Church, he would say that it's actually a matter of one of the most important theological axioms to hold that the origins of civil power are mediated, are democratic, are constitutionalist view of power. And he says that this is like a major theological axiom in the face of the danger of absolutist kings like James I, who pretend otherwise and who say that they have received their power immediately from God. So Suarez uses this metaphor of contract. So here you see also the link between political thought and law. Law is, of course, the instrument for the scholastics to think many problems that we would now not necessarily associate with law. For example, also in the field of dogmatic theology, the whole question of, okay, what's the relation between grace and nature? There too, they will use contractual metaphors to think these very complex theological issues. And so Suarez goes even further, and that's, of course, something that has given rise to a lot of debate, because many scholars also say that Suarez defended somehow from a Catholic point of view absolutism, because Suarez said, look, this contract by which the people confer the power which God originally gave them to the king, well, that takes the form of a donation. And of course, what is typical about the donation from a juridical point of view is that once you have donated something, you cannot ask it back. A donation is irrevocable. That's already, I mean, one of the rules in Roman law of donations. Once you have given for free something that belongs to another person, that other person, well, becomes its absolute honor, and you cannot take it away anymore. Of course, many discussions have been developed by Suarez, by other scholastics, about the right to resist, about the right to depose tyrants, and so on. But here I follow the conclusions of scholars like Harold Hapfel in his book Jesuit Political Thought, that we should really not exaggerate the practical relevance of these debates, because in practice it's also been shown by someone like Harold Brown in his book on Juan de Mariana. And practice, the Jesuits especially, but also other scholastics, will always give priority, to the king who was in power. And there was this presumption, this presumption that the political authorities were always right and that you had to obey. Okay, the discussions are possible. Here I just want to focus on the big lines. So this idea of the transfer of power from the people to the king as resting on a contract, so this constitutionalist view. We can also find it, for example, in the work of Lessius, whom Rosmini knew apparently quite well. Lessius actually says that it's a contract that is actually a locatio conductio. He says it's an employment contract. The people, they hire someone, they hire the king to perform certain services. What are those services? Well, rendering justice and making sure that everybody is safe. So it's, of course, a very minimalist view of what the role of the state is in this time. But so you can really see that they try to come to grips with the reality of power through the categories of contract law. And so here, Lessius, for example, says, contrary to Suarez, it's not donatio, it's a locatio conductio. And that gives him more flexibility also to say, well, if a person, if an employee is not performing well, is not doing what is asked from him, is not doing that for which he receives a salary, then we can criticize him. We can stop the collaboration. So that will give him more leverage to also develop a theory of resistance and even of the right to depose the tyrant. So many subtle nuances are, of course, always necessary when one talks about these authors. That is something I also take from the paper by Igor Agostini, which was presented here in December. He really stresses that very much, and I really agree with him, that we should not see the early modern scholastic movement as homogeneous. There are so many different voices. So I'm trying to summarize a little bit, but one always has to take into account that there are dissonant voices, and that as a lot of French colleagues who are specialists in early modern Catholic Church say now, we should see basically the church at that time as a combination of what they call des hétérodoxies croisées, so like crossed heterodoxies. So it's absolutely not homogeneous. Nevertheless, I think this constitutionalist view of power is something that is a red line through all these authors. The second point that always comes up in the 16th and 17th century, and which will be very important in the 19th century, of course, is this theory of the indirect power in temporal and secular affairs of the Supreme Pontiff. Well, to stay first with Suarez, I quote him here in his Defensio Fidei Catholicae. At one point, he says, it pertains to the Supreme Pontiff's office, first of all, to prevent the people from sinning and to remove anything that is likely to give occasion for sinning. And to that end, the pontiff is allowed to declare void or even nullify himself all laws and judgments made by secular authorities that favor sinning or enhance the chances of giving occasion for sinning. And by the same token, it pertains to the pontiff's office to promote faith, religion, and piety. As a result, he's allowed to prescribe or ordain a rule in their favor, regardless of any civil law precepts. End of the quote. It's just one of many quotes that I could give you about this whole idea that the church, if the salvation of the citizens is at stake, should be able to criticize, even revoke positive laws, should be able, as Bellarmine would then detail it in his Controversiae, should be able to depose certain kings. Gives examples then of Gregory VII, for example, who did that with the German emperor. Should be able to depose kings who are, for example, stimulating heresies. Should also be able to, reverse sentences, judgments rendered by civil courts that go against basic tenets of the Christian faith, and so on. Bellarmine is interesting in this regard because Bellarmine also in the course of his discussion in his Controversiae, so that's in the 1580s, about this indirect power, also uses this notion of the church as a perfect society, as a res publica perfecta. And this is, of course, also going to become in the 17th and in the 18th and the 19th centuries an extremely important concept for the church to defend itself against the power claims by the secular authorities. And we find this notion already in Bellarmine's Controversia in the 1580s. Basically, what he does, I find is interesting from a contemporary constitutionalist lawyer's perspective. He says, well, the church should be due to do anything necessary to be able to salvage its own end and mission, which is of course different from the mission of the civil society. I mean, we have Professor Todescan who has really written a lot about these different aims and fines of the civil and the ecclesiastical authorities. But he says, well, the ecclesiastical authorities have their own aim. They must make sure that people can gain salvation. But this implies sometimes that they also can meddle with temporal affairs. Constitutional lawyers today call this the theory of implied powers. This is something used, for example, very often in Belgium by the local governments, by the regional governments, to also do things which are normally only in the power of the federal government, because they, but if we need to have our own, if we need to take care of our own, the health of our own people, we should sometimes be able, for example, during the COVID crisis, to lay down our own rules about how we should manage this. This should not be just a matter of the federal government to deal with. Well, the implied powers, it was something of a similar kind of reasoning that Bellarmine, I think, developed to develop his theory of the indirect power of the church in temporal affairs. Which then became, of course, very important after the First Vatican Council after 1870. Well, I've cited in my written paper a number of authors and from the 19th century who deal with this theory. I will skip that. But still, I think what is important also to see is that this theory of the indirect power of the church in temporal affairs was not just something that Suarez and Bellarmine or the Jesuits developed, but was already much older. And a very good example of that is Martin de Azpilicueta, Dr. Navarrus, who is an author who has been a little bit forgotten in the 19th century, but who had actually been very important for the development of the Jesuits, their own theories. So Martin de Azpilicueta was actually very radical sometimes. Well, no doubt there is a personal element to that. Martin de Azpilicueta came from Navarra and had always been opposing the tendencies of Castile to try and get hold of the whole of Spain. And within this context had adhered to a very strong version of the constitutionalist power, ideas of the origins of civil power. And in this context had also developed the notion that the church had a lot of power to interfere in secular matters. So there are also these authors who in the 19th century are less present, but who in the 16th and 17th centuries really dominated the debate. So that's also something interesting, I think, that in the 19th century, there is a kind of process of canonization of certain authors, especially of Jesuits like Bellarmine and Suarez, especially in the context of this theory of indirect power. But in reality, these Jesuits took their ideas, well, from Cajetan or from Martin de Azpilicueta and many other late scholastics that have been more forgotten, perhaps. I go to the third point, which I think is central in the political thought of the early modern scholastics. And this is this willingness to defend the natural rights of the citizens against the exercise of arbitrary power by sovereigns, especially by sovereigns who aspire to absolutist power. Here again, many examples could be given, but I think one of the most notorious is the whole discussion that we can find in Juan de Mariana, the Jesuit author, Juan de Mariana, who criticized very, very lively the economic policy, the monetary policy by the Spanish king in his days, Philip III, who debased the money, basically, lowered the value of the copper coins that were circulating at the time, the velones, because that was interesting from him tax-wise, because he could get extra revenues because there was more minting fees then, and so on. But he criticized this positive law, this this monetary policy undertaken by the civil government, because he thought, well, it went against a good economic policy as he could see it in history. So based on experience, he was against it. But he was foremostly against it because he thought that this positive law, that these measures would violate the natural rights of the citizens, because he thought that this came down to robbery. So this is a concern, I think, which you find all the time in the early modern scholastic authors. How can we protect, How can we protect the citizens against arbitrariness on the part of the civil government? So they played this role of being critics of the government, and they were, so to speak, the voices of conscience, also through their role as confessors to many of the kings. They were the voice of conscience to these confessors. And I find that an interesting idea to mention, or to stress a little bit in the context of this meeting on Rosmini, because you know this much better than I, but Rosmini at some point, he mentioned that he had this idea of setting up an institution, a supreme political tribunal, that would be able to enforce higher law rights against the centralized state. So here we have this like a very parallel idea. So what Mariana was doing in the 16th, 17th century, as the voice of conscience, who would recall the natural rights, natural law, superior to some of the economic policies, the positive laws enacted by the kings. Well, that same mechanism is now like formalized even further, one could say, by Mariana through this idea of having a supreme political tribunal, which is like a forum internum for the 19th century in this new context of state power and diminished ecclesiastical power. That brings me to another similarity, at least superficially, between Rosmini and many other Catholic thinkers in the early 19th century and the early modern scholastics. That is, this willingness to protect liberty, liberty in the sense of the liberty of the church, this very old notion already that we find in the 11th and 12th century, of course, Gregorian reform. Also the liberty of conscience of the citizens. So, for example, in the Constitution under social justice, la Costituzione secondo la giustizia sociale, Rosmini says, I translate here in English, liberty needs an eminent authority which is vigilant over the legislative power. This authority protecting the freedom of the proletarians is that of the Supreme Political Tribunal, in charge of containing the legislative power within the limit of rational and natural justice. It's an important idea, and that brings me to the last point of my paper. Last point of my paper was a bit at the intersection of social philosophy and political philosophy, if you want. But since I've been talking only about, mostly about Bellarmine and Suarez and Mariana, about Jesuits, and only very briefly about the Dominican Cajetan, let me go back to another example of a Dominican friar who was a very major early modern scholastic, namely Domingo de Soto. By the way, that also allows me to bring this lecture, so to speak, back to Trento, because at some point, Domingo de Soto, this important professor of theology at the University of Salamanca, was staying in Trento. He was attending the Council of Trent as an envoy of Charles V. So in 1545, so the same year in which the council started, he had actually published a treatise on poor relief, on how we should help the poor, the Deliberatio in Causa Pauperum. And that work became soon very famous, and the Venetians, who knew that Domingo de Soto was around, so to speak, at one point called upon his advice, because in Venice too, there were debates about whether we should organize poor relief through urban, so secular institutions, or if we should leave it like before to private charity and to ecclesiastical institutions. And Domingo de Soto, of course, in his treatise, had argued that we should not transfer this power and responsibility to public institutions, that we should keep it with private charity and with ecclesiastical organization of poor relief. And so he said basically the same to the Serenissima, to the authorities of Venice. Because why was he against public poor relief? Because, well, he thought it was against the interests of the poor, of the rightful poor. So here we see again this willingness to defend the natural rights of the citizens against what Soto and other scholastics consider to be arbitrary policy instruments, right? So defending natural law against civil law. But it was also about, for political reasons, of course, that he was against the public administration of poor relief, because that was exactly what the Lutherans were doing. That was exactly what the Lutherans were doing, you know, to the extent that in cities like Cologne, or also in Ypres in Flanders, which was then under Protestant influence, they would take away this responsibility from the clergymen and give it to lay authorities, because they thought that was more efficient, and they also thought that religious people should not take care of these temporal affairs. So in Soto's eyes, for whom the danger of Lutheranism was like on top of his agenda, especially here in Trent, he would say, no, this is dangerous. This is a kind of secularization, a first kind of secularization, whereby we transfer administrative power from the church to the civil power, to the potestas of the magistrate. And that's a Protestant thing. We Catholics, we don't want to know about that. This point is also going to become, and that's where I'm going to end my presentation, this point also becomes important in the 19th century, of course. We have Rosmini, who in 1828 will found his Institute of Charity, but it's something we see all across Europe, that Catholics who are against the French Revolution, who are quite conservative, they decide that Catholics should take this initiative of poor relief. And we should not leave that to public institutions, because that's a form of secularization. It goes against the interests of the church as an institution. It sounds like Protestantism. I wanted to give you a quote of Rosmini in this regard. Let me check if I can find it. Otherwise, yeah, I found it here. We also find this very conservative, I think, thought in Rosmini, just like it was the case in Soto, that somehow we need a kind of paternalism, that the poor must be taken care of by the rich, and that is necessary not just for the poor for their material survival, but also for the rich for their spiritual salvation. So there is this economy of salvation which is at stake, according to Soto. According to Soto, it's also important that while taking care of the poor, we actually maintain the existing political order. He doesn't want a revolution. He doesn't want the poor to take power. And that's something we can see also in Rosmini. Rosmini, at some point in the Constitution under Social Justice, says, we should not give the poor political power. Of course, we should take care of them by giving alms, by being charitable. But we should not give them political power, as these French want to do in their constitution. Such attribution, he says, would be pernicious. It would instill in the people, in the poor, the temptation to abuse their political power, to draw themselves somebody else's property over which they would acquire influence. To expect that those who contribute nothing to the treasury of the state be given electoral rights is an opinion damaging to property. Okay. So these very conservative intuitions, I think, is something that is shared between many 19th century Catholics and early modern scholastics like Domingo de Soto. Even though, of course, as you know better than I do, in the late 19th century, you will have increasingly Catholics who are even the fathers of Christian democracy and who want to think about also giving political voice to the normal, ordinary people. So where does that leave us? Once again, I would like to stress the fact that what, in my view, binds the 19th century and the 16th, 17th century forms of scholasticism is a kind of preoccupation with the rise of the modern state. Is a kind of preoccupation with the rise of Leviathan. That's what they are afraid of, and that's what they want to combat. I think Rosmini is a bit more modern than the 16th and 17th century scholastics. I mean, Dr. Soliani has clearly shown that at some point, despite the fact that he expresses his admiration for the scholastics, Rosmini also says that these scholastics well, are like a dead body that can no longer be revived. So he kind of feels that their attempts to fight against the rise of modernity has failed, and we should try to do it another way. But still, this distrust of Leviathan is something that he shares, I think, fundamentally with the scholastics. I had another citation here, tried to find it, but in which he really says, Rosmini, that he is against the rise of this absolutist state. Yeah, I have found it here again. So at some point in La Costituzione secondo la giustizia sociale, he says, well, one of the ruinous consequences of contemporary political constitutions, like in Belgium, like in France, is that they abandon religion to the mercy of political interests. They divest the church of its liberty. And these modern constitutions, I cite him here, hide in their breast the most enormous absolutism. You see, so it's really about this rise of Leviathan, the rise of the modern state that they are preoccupied with. And I think Rosmini could recognize that in the early modern scholastic authors. Nevertheless, I think he fully realized that the early modern scholastics were too nostalgic, and that he could not bring back to life the period of the 11th and the 12th century. I mean, if you look at the early modern scholastics, faced with the threat of Leviathan, they constantly refer back, for example, to the age of Pope Innocent III. That's their reference period. That's what they want to go back to the Council of 1215. That is something which Lessius, which Suarez cites in their work on the Defensio Fidei. They want there to be this collaboration between the civil power and the ecclesiastical power, but which at the same time kind of recognizes the superiority of the ecclesiastical power. And I think that those days were the old days in Rosmini's view. And I think Rosmini realized that, well, it was of no use to remain stuck in that kind of deep nostalgia, which he could read in the early modern scholastic authors. I thank you for your attention. And of course, there is many room for debate, I think.
Very much. Lascio la parola a Damiano Simoncelli dell'Università di Venezia, tutore della materia.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your interesting talk, which I appreciated. And well, I just present 3 remarks that, in my view, they could be the starting points for further discussion. And namely, the first one is concerning Rosmini's references to Leonardus Lessius. The second one is regarding Rosmini and Bellarmine. The third one is on the doctrine of indirect power of the church in the secular affairs. So let's look at the first point. My first comment on your talk focuses on the role of Leonard Leys in Rosmini's thought. I think that the parallel you have just drawn between the Ram and Rosmini regarding Leys is very interesting. In fact, the letter to Don Giacomo Molinari can very well hint at a shared awareness of the role that Leys would play for a Catholic intellectual in the 19th century in terms of a model of a theologian. I would also wonder if Rosmini would have somehow done in the 1940s, sorry, what the neo-scholastics of Louvain did 40 years later. More precisely, not only did Rosmini suggest Leys neo-scholastics of success lies for the life choice, but also referred to him within his history of natural right at the beginning of the philosophy of right, which is a work published between 1841 and 1843. Accepting a threefold distinction by Gottlieb Hufeland, Rosmini holds that one can look at the history of the science of natural right as divided into three phases. The first phase is the age of fragmentary treatment of this science. The second age is the age of the systematic and indeterminate treatment. The third age is the age of the systematic and determinate treatment. At the same time, he puts in question the precise date of the beginning of each age by arguing that the progress in the matter, the progress of the ideas, is not always the same as the progress of the form of the structure of the books. When did Hufeland find the date of the beginning of the second age? As it emerges from Rosmini's philosophy of right, it seemed to be identified in 1625, the publication year of Huig van Groot's De Jure Belli ac Pacis. Yet Rosmini distances himself from this, noticing that even Aquinas' Summa Theologiae can be very well considered to be part of this second age of the history of science of natural right. Later, however, one can find treatises on justice and right in which, I quote, in Aquinas' footsteps, the doctrines belonging to the natural right are subtly discussed. End of the quotation. As it happens, Rosmini says in Lessius, and here the reference is to the Justitia et Iure, Libri Quatuor, Louvain 1604. And also in the second reference is to the Lugo. What struck me is that in Rosmini's framework, Lacey's work play an important role, at least historically, in the development of the science of natural right, and in some ways, those works can be regarded as a model. I am not familiar with the late 19th century Louvain neoscholasticism. Therefore, the question for me remains open in regard of possible points of agreement and disagreement compared to the perspectives such as the one of Victor Brandt's. This is the first point I would like to make. The second one is regarding Rosmini and Bellarmine. So my second comment is concerned with the presence of Bellarmine's thought in Rosmini. His explicit reference to the Jesuit doctor in the philosophy of right occurs twice, when discussing the nature of the church and the effectiveness of the powers of its ministers, even in the case of sinful conduct of this latter. In both cases, Rosmini refers to Bellarmine's De Ecclesia Militante. As to the first topic, that is the nature of the church, Bellarmine helps Rosmini to make the point that the visible church is a perfect society, even if it has an invisible part. In fact, the Jesuit held that, and I quote, "The church is a society of human beings," end of the quote, and consequently, it has a constitutive visible part in that, and I quote, "A society of humans cannot be said a society of humans if it does not reveal itself consistent in external and visible signs. In fact, humans cannot acknowledge themselves as a part of a society if societal bonds are not external and visible." End of the quotation. As to the second topic, The reference to Bellarmine is explicative to the treatment of the sacerdotal character and its faculties that cannot be lost in case of absence of the divine grace in the minister. Here, Rosmini recovers the Bellarminian distinction between to be members of the church while living members of the body, ratio membri ut est pars quaedam vivi corporis, that is based on the presence of charity, that is the divine grace in the member, and the other part of the distinction, to be members of the church qua instrument, ratio instrumenti, that depends on having received the power of the order and jurisdiction. In line with Bellarmine, Rosmini argues that one can be a member of the church qua instrument, even lacking of one's membership while living member. These are the references to Bellarmine, explicit references I found in the Philosophy of Right. And this leads me to the third comment on your talk and last comment of your talk that deals with the doctrine of indirect power of the church. This comment is aimed at corroborating your claim that the recovery of the early modern scholastics is useful for the 11th century Catholic thinkers to struggle against the Leviathan. At least in Rosmini, one can find a strong commitment for the freedom of the church, as well as for the human right to cultivate human relationship with God. In Rosminian terms, the right belonging to every human being of being part of the theocratic society. While encouraging colleagues more expert than me in the field of political philosophy of Rosmini to go more in depth regarding the relationship between theocratic society and the church, I would rather focus on the topic of the freedom of the Catholic Church as a bridle of the absolutist drives in the secular power. Even if there is no explicit reference to Suarez and Bellarmine, it seems to me that in Rosmini the doctrine of the indirect power of the Church in temporal affairs takes the form of the critical role that he grants to the Church. What does this critical role consist in? If we consider the political opuscules, and more precisely the one entitled The Main Political and Religious Issues of the Present Day, this is the translated title, where Rosmini argues that to the Church was given the Church was given the supreme powers in moral matters, while the state the supreme power in matters of utility. Since utility is subordinated to morality, the Church has a certain primacy over the state and can interfere when this latter affects matters pertaining to morality. Against the idea of the absolute separation and autonomy between church and state, Rosmini says that, and I quote, "We grant the civil governments the autonomy in the sphere of the useful, sphere subordinated to that of the honest. Thus, even for us, the power of the state and the power of the church are entirely distinct. The power of the state is absolute regarding the useful, in which its immediate end consists, but the condition that the useful is subordinated to the honest." End of the quote. Finally, it seems noteworthy to me that Rosmini refers indirectly to Bellarmine's treatment of the indirect power of the Church, as it is exposed in De Romano Pontifice, when he thinks of the relationship between the state and the Church in terms of an organism composed by body and soul. In fact, similar seems to me the manner in which Bellarmine understands these relationships in the mentioned controversy, and my reference here is the book 2nd, chapter 6th. These are my comments on your interesting and very rich talk. Thank you again for delivering this talk to us, and some questions that I would like to raise.
Thank you.
Se ci sono poi altre domande, intanto c'è già molto da dire.
Am I supposed to react?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So I think you added a lot of additional interesting elements regarding the use by Rosmini of the early modern scholastics. Yeah, so it will also be interesting indeed to know more about how Rosmini deals with Grotius, because indeed, well, in the modern natural law, or the Protestant natural law, of course, Grotius will become associated with the arrival of a very modern paradigm. But in fact, the sources of Grotius are Lessius and Suarez, so it's a bit paradoxical. There was this need to find a Catholic alternative to the Protestant natural law as it developed in the 17th and 18th centuries, than to the encyclopedic movement. So Rosmini is fully part of that endeavor, I think, to try and formulate again a new Catholic alternative. So it's interesting that he knows Grotius, but at the same time takes his distance with him. Your reference to Browns also. I haven't found any references to Rosmini in the work of Browns yet, but maybe I should just be more careful in paying attention. Of course, what I think could play a role is that but by that time, Rosmini was a bit considered as problematical, of course. But anyway, these 19th century Catholic intellectuals, of course, Rosmini is the first half of the 19th century, Browns is then the second half, but they seem to have been aware of one another, and there have been so many circles, and especially once you have Aeterni Patris in 1879, you have even more international networks than there used to be already before with the Freiburg circle, and you have all these circles. So I guess an awful lot of knowledge must have been shared there among these 19th century Catholics. Also regarding the inspiration that they could take from the early modern scholastic. So yeah, just a very interesting point which you have stressed and which deserves further investigation. I would say this idea that indeed Rosmini took Lessius as an inspiration for modern Catholic intellectuals. That exactly what happened also then in Louvain, where the Ram saw him as a model Catholic intellectual, and that remained until at least the beginning of the 20th century like that. So this need to find models in the early modern period is something that is very clearly present in the 19th century. We can also see it in the foundation of new charitable or religious orders in the 19th century who refer back to 17th century models. Sorry, the name escapes me now, but there is this very important 17th century French saint who gave rise to the foundation of a religious order in the 19th century that really cared about the poor. His name escapes me now, but it's just as another example of the fact that, yeah, these 19th century Catholics, whether they were doing more intellectual work or practical work, they constantly have this 16th and 17th century in mind somehow. Yeah, so as models. So that's about your first point. Yeah, Rosmini and Bellarmine. So yeah, it's very clear that in terms of ecclesiology, Bellarmine's influence has been tremendous, and so in that sense, it's not not surprising that Rosmini as well, in many of his writings, as you showed, apparently knew very well what Bellarmine was saying about, well, the Ecclesia Militans, for example, this perfect society. Of course, there was the whole issue that you can see very clearly in Bellarmine. He was really reacting against Calvin. He names the Calvinists very explicitly. For example, when he talks about the indirect power of the church in temporal affairs, when he talks about the Societas Perfecta, because of course, the Calvinists, the Protestants, had been putting forward this idea of the invisible church, the invisible group of people who are elected, and then that is something that went against the Catholic view and this more visible, perfect society. Yeah, it's also an interesting point, and I think could be studied more. How is this whole ecclesiology of Bellarmine being redeployed in many different ways in the 19th century? And then your third point, which was about this indirect power of the church in temporal affairs. Well, very interesting that you referred to this way in which Rosmini says that the temporal authorities should take care of everything that is useful, but that we should not confound what is useful with what is honorable, what is honest. Also reminds me of Cicero, of course. So maybe in the use of his terminology, Rosmini was also very much influenced there by the De Officiis of Cicero. But anyway, so also this idea that then the church is responsible for making sure that the honest prevails over the useful and remains more important, that the church is the head of this whole body, which is leading. Yeah, that's indeed an idea which is very strong in the early modern scholastic authors. So very interesting that you pointed out the way that in which that is being like rethought, this whole idea in Rosmini. So clearly a lot of food for thought, and one would have to stay for months and months in the office of Paolo Bonafede, where you have all the opera omnia of Rosmini, and then go systematically through all of these works to check how he refers explicitly or implicitly to the scholastic tradition. That's of course something I couldn't do for this paper, but clearly also once again from your comments, it transpires that it's worthwhile doing that. Yeah.
Just a last very brief remark and with a precise question. You referred to the metaphor of contract regarding the relationship between the citizens and the sovereign, and the way in which both Suarez and Lessius thought about it. And I was wondering if this idea of contract in Jesuit thinkers or early modern scholastics if it just limited to Suarez and Lessius, or there is a broader debate about the way in which this contract, if there is a donation or a hire or something different, has to be conceived.
Yeah, I think it was very widespread. Actually, they took this from the Jus Commune tradition. There was this passage, the Lex Regia, already in Roman law, from which many medieval jurists had derived that we have to think of the origins of civil power in contractual terms. So Bartles also goes into that. So it's actually a very medieval idea, which they take up there, but they just further develop it. And of course, one has to take into account that contract is a seemingly stable notion, but the way in which we envisage contract changes over time. For example, in the Jus Commune tradition, which was very much also under influence of canon law, the idea is that, okay, agreements are binding, pacta sunt servanda, but at the same time, there are implied conditions. There is always the conditio tacita that, for example, you remain bound by your promise in as much as the circumstances remain unaltered. But if circumstances change, then you do not have to keep your promise anymore. So that means that this notion of contract is much weaker, for example, than in a system where a contract exists without the notion of, for example, the doctrine of frustration of contract, as it's called nowadays, or of, clausula rebus sic stantibus. And that is a turn that actually happens in the 16th, 17th century. That because of, for example, Juan de Lugo, cited by Rosmini, at some point says that we should no longer accept this notion of a conditio tacita, as the medieval canon lawyers had done, in the notion of contract. So that makes the notion of contract more absolute. And of course, if you then use it as a metaphor for political power, that also has consequences. It also means that the power, once it has been transferred, it becomes something absolute somehow. Whereas if you have the conditio tacita in mind when thinking about contracts, it's easier to say, oh, well, the circumstances have changed considerably. This prince is not behaving at all in the interest of the bonum commune and is not living as we expected. Yeah, you can have arguments to cast into doubt this original contract. This is also linked to the idea that contract is actually a kind of a law which the parties impose upon themselves. That's another metaphor that is very frequent, for example, in the work of Suarez or Lugo. Well, if the notion of the lex changes, then also your notion of contract changes. For the late medieval theologians and jurists, well, the law is valid as long as it does not go counter to its ultimate aim or its soul. So there is always this idea that, summum jus summa injuria, that at some point when the law does no longer attain its objective, that we should perhaps question the legitimacy of that law and no longer apply it. That's standard late medieval legal and theological thinking, which you can find still clearly around 1500, for example, in the work of Adrian of Utrecht, later Pope Adrian VI, who was also an important scholastic thinker. But this shifts radically in a little bit less than 150 years, because Lugo, for example, will say, yeah, but no, a law is absolute. A law is, even if the law does no longer really fulfill its aim, still it's absolute. So you have to observe it. You have to keep it. So they do no longer accept the idea of cessante causa, cessat lex, or cessante ratione, cessat lex, which was part of understanding of interpreting laws for the medieval jurists and theologians. And so this changes a little bit in the 16th and 17th century. So that, of course, is one of the arguments that is used by scholars who think that early modern scholastics, well, somehow justified or helped contribute to the rise of absolutist regimes, also a more absolutist understanding of the law, because you have these subtle shifts, of course, of conditionality that was there in the Middle Ages and that disappears in the analysis of law, in the analysis of contract in 16th and 17th century authors.
Thank you.
Ci sono altre domande? Altrimenti poi ci aspetto una pausa micro perché siamo molto avanti coi tempi, ma...
Ok.
Ogni volta che io vengo a Trento e so che sono vicino al Duomo, mi viene sempre in mente che il Duomo, come tutti sappiamo, c'era il Concilio di Trento e che a Trento doveva venire Francisco de Vittoria come rappresentante di Carlo V. Poi, a causa dei suoi problemi di salute, Vittoria non poté andare, fu incaricato Domingo de Soto e quindi qui a Trento venne Domingo de Soto. Ecco, la mia domanda è questa: dalla mia, come dirò domani, non so se fondatissima o infondatissima ricerca delle fonti, limitatamente, ripeto, al filosofia del diritto, quindi non so nelle altre, però tra le assenze rilevanti è quella di Domingo de Soto, il che mi ha meravigliato, in particolare non tanto perché Soto era venuto a Trento, ma perché Rosmini, delle opere della seconda scolastica, privilegia più il filone de Justitia et Iure che non il filone de Legibus. Allora, il de Justitia et Iure di Soto era sicuramente un classico e non lo vedo citato. Allora, sarebbe curioso sapere se non è citato perché semplicemente non aveva a disposizione l'opera, perché non ha trovato cose che gli interessasse, però mi ha colpito un po' questo silenzio su un Soto che era venuto a Trento.
Mi sembra un'ottima osservazione, una domanda molto utile e interessante, quindi perché non fa riferimento in modo esplicito a Domingo de Soto? Forse i specialisti di Rosmini potranno dare una risposta a questa domanda. Diciamo, io condivido questa osservazione che nel Ottocento in genere c'è un tipo di canonizzazione palesemente di certi teologi della seconda scolastica e altri vengono persi o dimenticati, non so perché. Ho visto che nel testo di il dottor Soliani che Cagetano viene citato, quindi almeno un teologo domenicano viene citato, quindi non può avere a che fare con il fatto che Soto era un domenicano. Non so, è strano, ma anche Aspilqueta, per esempio, Dr. Navarus, non è molto conosciuto da Rosmini. Ho ben letto
Era nella
il
biblioteca.
tuo... Era nella biblioteca, sì. Ma è una, sì, è una domanda molto interessante perché citano certi autori, altri no. Allora, nel caso di Rosmini è ancora più strano perché siccome lui aveva un rapporto con i gesuiti un po' problematici, uno ci aspetterei che fa piuttosto riferimento ai domenicani o altri teologi non gesuiti, ma no, cita Bellarmino, cita Suarez, che sono i gesuiti. Quindi non posso solo dire che condivido la sua osservazione.
Al volo mi aggancio a questa osservazione su Aspilqueta, proprio facendo una ricognizione partendo dall'indice dei nomi. Nella filosofia del diritto io ho trovato De Aspilqueta citato, ma non come fonte primaria, viene ripreso all'interno di una citazione di Grozio, all'interno di una riflessione più ampia di Rosmini sui limiti dell'esercizio del diritto di legittima difesa, soprattutto in relazione alla questione dell'onore. E quello serve, dice con la citazione di Grozio, in cui si dice che l'onore non è sufficiente a, come dire, addirittura a pensare, e Rosmini questo è in accordo, a pensare che uno che abbia avuto una lesione d'onore, per esempio, prenda una spada e trafiga il suo avversario. E in quella citazione lì de Justitia et Iure, sì, de Iure Belli et Pacis, c'era proprio questo micro riferimento a De Aspilqueta.
Sì, c'è prima.
Sì, no,
Sì.
poi
il professor Nicoletti.
volevo far presente che da Trento sul peccato originale Rosmini cita per esteso Domingo del Sotto e approvandone in toto anche la dottrina. Quindi comunque è un autore che lui conosceva e mi pare che stimasse. Quindi se mai questo rafforza il dubbio perché non si trovi, però escluderei che non lo conoscesse proprio perché almeno sulla questione del peccato originale, per quel che ho avuto modo di leggere, sembra essere la sua fonte principale.
Ok. Grazie di aver accennato a questa presenza di Soto in questi altri tipi di dibattiti intorno al peccato originale. Lui fa riferimento a De Natura et Grazia? questo libro di sotto?
Probabile.
No?
Probabile, sì.
Sì. Ma questo, penso questo è anche lo scopo di questo progetto di ricerca, no? Di cercare a stabilire quali erano le fonti di Rosmini e richiede proprio un grande progetto di ricerca, richiede molto tempo, ovviamente.
Grazie, solo un breve commento di ringraziamento per la relazione così bella del professor De Kock e le notazioni così utili. Vorrei dire che il progetto sta funzionando molto bene, perché questo dialogo tra studiosi di Rosmini e studiosi della prima scolastica moderna o seconda scolastica sta dando molti frutti. Sono molto grato di aver indicato questi punti, che sono punti molto importanti, perché quello che ha detto sul contratto è molto utile per Rosmini, perché di solito la posizione di Rosmini viene messa in connessione con la posizione di John Locke o di altre forme di contrattualismo moderno, ma questa eredità, prima di tutto medievale, dello ius comune, che per Rosmini è fondamentale, la costruzione della società civile nei comuni italiani, per esempio, come la descrive e così via. Però questi riferimenti sono molto illuminanti. E così anche sulla legislazione sui poveri, che è un grandissimo tema rosminiano in confronto con le teorie 7-800, molto importante. Sulla potestas indirecta ha risposto, diciamo, la notazione di Damiano Simoncelli è molto utile, perché in questi scritti finali di Rosmini, le questioni politiche e religiose in polemica con il Regno di Sardegna e le sue prese di posizione in materia di istruzione, di matrimonio, Bellarmino ritorna. Però negli scritti del 48, e lei ha citato il tribunale politico, è molto interessante perché, secondo me, il tribunale politico di Rosmini viene dalla riflessione settecentesca e ottocentesca sull'eforato e sui giuri costituzionali e sulla Corte Suprema degli Stati Uniti.
Okay.
E sono questi strumenti che in qualche modo ereditano anche la funzione della potestas indirecta, che Fichte, quando parla dell'eforato, parla Staatsinterdikt, sembra quasi appunto. E il tribunale politico discute appunto di ciò che è onesto, di ciò che è giusto rispetto a ciò che è utile. E la cosa interessante è che è uno strumento eletto a suffragio universale, quindi anche i poveri possono votare, però l'elettorato passivo, i nomi dei possibili candidati sono depositati presso le parrocchie.
Okay.
Quindi è un interessante tentativo di, come dire, modernizzare dentro un quadro di Costituzione moderna questa funzione di giudizio sul giusto e così via. Quindi questo qui apre un terreno molto interessante. Ma scusate, avremo tempo perché so che è tardi.
Io chiudo solo con, poi facciamo la pausa, con due piccole, diciamo, questioni che non sono proprio di dettaglio, ma che sono secondo me interessanti da approfondire. L'importanza di Juan de Lugo per la definizione di giustizia, che Rosmini dà nella filosofia del diritto, e su questo nella scolastica moderna c'è molto dibattito, no? Antonio Perez, lo stesso Lessius, eccetera. Ecco, e l'altra questione è, ma questo lo dico, non sono un esperto di filosofia del diritto, di filosofia della politica, nel Gaetano credo, ma magari me lo confermerete voi che siete più esperti di me su questo, confluì nel costituzionalismo del Gaetano confluisce anche una linea di pensiero più francescana, no? Forse meno legata alla linea domenicana, non so, credo.
Um,
Una domanda da...
sì, sì, sulla definizione dei diritti di di justum, eccetera, c'è ovviamente in questi trattati di Justitia Jure ci sono sempre dei capitoli che riguardano quelle definizioni. Michel Villet si è già interessato anche a questa letteratura. È un tema interessante, ma personalmente quello che mi interessa ancora di più è di vedere come funziona qual è l'utilizzo pragmatico di tutti questi termini. Per esempio, quando si dibatte sulla povertà e come allora questa idea di diritti soggettivi venendo dal ius naturale possono consentire a Domingo di Soto di essere molto critico verso queste nuove leggi che cercano di restringere proprio l'accesso all'aiuto. E quindi non conosco neanche di cuore, diciamo, tutte queste definizioni, è proprio sembra molto sottile anche. Allora, sul scotismo, anche questo è una cosa che forse Igor Agostini ha già cercato di dimostrare che secondo me non è una buona strategia fare questa opposizione troppo forte fra scotismo e tomismo della scolastica del 5 e del 600. Anche nelle carriere di questi grandi teologi noi vediamo che hanno studiato anche la via nuova e la via antiqua, hanno una formazione ibrida. Anche Domingo de Soto, per esempio, a Parigi ha studiato molto il scotismo e poi la loro carriera ogni tanto comincia come professore della filosofia scotista. Quindi loro conoscono il tomismo, il scotismo, conoscono Gregorio di Rimini. Quindi è una cultura molto ibrida, mi sembra, in cui non fa senso di cercare sempre a dire questo è un elemento scotista, questo è un elemento tomista. Forse questo è una tentazione che viene dopo Aeterni Patris nel 1879, ma nel 5 e il 600 la mia impressione è che c'è una grande apertura e anche i domenicani possono seguire a un certo punto Duns Scotus invece di Tommaso su certi punti. Quindi è molto eterogenea e molto ibrida questa cultura. Sul punto più preciso delle origini del potere civile non dovrei andare a vedere di nuovo i riferimenti, i testi, ma non ho avuto l'impressione che lui cerca di giustificare le sue opinioni facendo riferimento a Scoto piuttosto che a Tommaso. Questo è qualcosa che non... questo dovrei di nuovo guardare i test.
Sì.
Ma secondo me la questione è un po' meno importante per i scolastici del 5 e del 600 che per noi e per i cattolici del 800 e del 900. Grazie.